Hello, everyone. It's Frances Widdowson here. For people who are unaware of who I am, I was a tenured professor at Mount Royal University until 2021 when I was wrongfully terminated for a number of factors, but one of them being criticizing various issues such as the residential schools, the existing conceptualization of the residential schools, as well as trans activism. And trans activism is the subject that I wanted to talk to you about today because I have some breaking news, and that is that the journalist and researcher Mia Hughes will be on my podcast on March 27th, which is next Thursday. And as a lead up to that interview, which for people who don't know Mia Hughes, she is an incredible researcher who has blown the lid off what is called WPATH, which is about an organization which pretends to be a scientific research body about transgender health issues, but instead is an organization which has been taken over by trans activists. And Mia Hughes wrote an incredible report called the WPATH Files that examines the pseudoscientific character of this organization's and the kind of recommendations that this organization made for transgender health. And as a result of this organization, many young people are being seriously harmed because of the advice that they are getting from this trans activist controlled organization. So Mia Hughes and I will be discussing the WPATH files, but because of my background, what I'm also hoping to do is to talk about the climate in universities, the terrible self-censorious climate that exists around a number of issues. And in this case, it is the issue of trans activism. And this resulted in me being pushed out of the university. This was one of the issues that resulted in me being pushed out of the university. So what I've done is that I have created a post on the Wokeacademy.info site that is discussing some of the background with respect to my case and how trans activism was involved in me being pushed out of Mount Royal. And I've been thinking about doing this post for quite some time, since around September 2024, because of what happened at a Mount Royal Faculty Association meeting on September 20th, 2024. And what happened at that meeting was that I tried to go to it because my case was going to be discussed. I was not allowed to attend that meeting. I was escorted out of that meeting and told that there was just going to be procedural discussions. It wasn't going to be about the content. It turned out that two professors, Scott Murray and Mary Lee Mulholland, were able to make all sorts of criticisms of my actions. Some of them were completely false, and I was not given an opportunity to respond to their claims. So I wanted to provide a bit of background about that, but also about another professor whose name is D.A. Dirks, who was one of the professors who filed a harassment complaint against me. And D.A. Dirks is also the partner of Scott Murray. And so Scott Murray's comments are related to the fact that he is closely aligned with D.A. Dirks and to some extent is trying to put forward D.A. Dirks's position in these various forums. And interestingly, D.A. Dirks teaches in a variety of areas, but one of the things that she teaches about is the WPATH standards of care. And there's actually a lecture that DA Dirks, or some information DA Dirks goes by they, them pronouns, that DA Dirks is providing to students on the WPATH standards of care. And I have a video of that information that Dirks is providing. So I provided that video to Mia Hughes, and I'm hoping on Thursday that we are going to be able to go through some of the more pseudoscientific points that Dirks is providing to Dirks' students. Anyway, so in order to give you a sense of this post, which I think is going to be very relevant to the discussion that Mia Hughes and I are going to have on March 27th, I just wanted to share my screen with you to show you this post. So this post is available on the www.wokeacademy.info site. This is the address up in this top corner, left-hand corner. And this is a site that has been developed by me and a number of other people to discuss my firing. So you can go into that if you want to find out all the various episodes with respect to my firing, and also discusses the arbitration decision. My case is currently being appealed to the Alberta Labor Relations Board, but all the various things that happened in the actual arbitration up to the point of the appeal are discussed there. So that's a great deal of information that you might be interested in. And some of the information I'm going to be talking about now, you can find more detailed accounts in the Francis Widdowson firing area or the arbitration decision area. But what I'm interested in for this video is this post, Trans Activism, Some MRU Professors, and Mia Hughes, just to link the interview that I'm going to be having with Mia Hughes and what has been going on at Mount Royal University for about 5 years with respect to trans activism. And I'm going to try to just move through this quickly because you will notice that there are a lot of documents, and you can just go into that post to look at these documents. Okay, so let's get into this. This picture, these are on the left-hand side is DA Dirks, and on the right-hand side is Scott Murray. This picture was posted publicly, but I think it gives one a good sense of the kind of activist climate that existed at Mount Royal with respect to the trans activist file for many years. And what I do in this post is I talk first about the September 20th, 2024 Mount Royal Faculty Association meeting. And I was very reluctant to do this post. It's been about 6 months that I've been thinking about this, because what happens is when I try to defend myself, which I should be able to do, it's used as evidence that I don't get along with people. And it's not that I don't get along with people, it's that the activist kind of climate does not respect academic freedom. And that means that you are not able to ask questions about the claims that are being made. And this is being used by a number of activist professors, and was used when I was at Mount Royal University, to ostracize me and poison my work environment. I find it very necessary to respond to the false allegations that are being made about me. And because I'm not allowed to do that within the union, because I've been pushed out of the union, I have to do it publicly, because that's the only way that I can communicate and correct the record as with respect to these particular areas. Anyway, there is a document here, which if you want to go into these documents, you just go on this chevron, these two chevrons on the right-hand side, and you go into the presentation mode. And what that does is it then gives you the document, which you can look at. So that's going into that document. And what it does is it's an account, an eyewitness account of what happened on September 20th, 2024. And what occurred was Murray and Mulholland were complaining about essentially the union defending me, and were upset about some terminology that was being used with respect to the arbitration decision, which refers to what was called the Gang of 17. And the Gang of 17, as it was called, is a group of 17 faculty members who I filed in one go harassment complaints against. And it was part of a mob. It's much larger, the mob was, in 17, but 17 were just the initial 17 that had complaints filed against them. Anyway, there was great umbrage taken with the fact that this terminology was used, and I was blamed for coining this phrase. And when I went through my notes of the arbitration hearings, which are a quasi transcript, I found, and I hadn't initiated that terminology, but I wasn't exactly sure where it come from, and it was actually developed by Michael Ford, who was the lawyer for Mount Royal University. So I was being blamed for that terminology. I never initiated this terminology. I might have used it in the arbitration hearings. I'm not sure if I did or not, because I don't have the notes I wasn't allowed to take notes when I was on the stand. So I don't know what was said, but it was Michael Ford who started it. So everyone began to just call it the Gang of 17. Anyway, Scott Murray claimed that I had made this term up to draw parallels between the 17 faculty members who I filed complaints against and the Gang of Four in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And I had no knowledge. I'm not an expert in Chinese politics, so I wouldn't have been able to do that anyway, but I did not initiate this Gang of 17. So what I've done here is I've just provided the evidence that shows that Michael Ford was the person who actually put forward this phrase. And then it was repeated by Elizabeth Evans, who was the previous provost and vice president academic. And in the defense of Evans was just using the terminology because Ford had used it. So she was not making it up either, but those are the instances of the use of that term in my notes. And it certainly was Ford, because I would not have done that in such a formal setting, is to use that kind of colloquial language. Okay, so that's kind of the reason why I think this should come to light. I should kind of talk about this because a lot of claims were made in that meeting, which I think I need to address. And because of Hughes's interview, the interview that I'm been doing with Hughes, it's a good opportunity to talk about that as well. And you might be wondering why there is so much animosity that is being directed towards me by people like Scott Murray and Mary Lee Mulholland. And there's a number of reasons, but one of the main ones is they are supporters of trans activism. And this was very apparent in Mulholland's testimony. And Scott Murray, the partner of Scott Murray, is Dirks. So Murray is often defending Dirks, and Dirks is a non-binary identifying trans activist who wants people to call Dirks by they, them pronouns, which of course causes a lot of problems because Dirks is a human female, an adult human female, and Dirks looks like a woman. So of course Dirks is going to be called she quite a lot, but Dirks gets very upset about this and believes that they're being misgendered, and this causes a lot of conflicts. Anyway, so in terms of Dirks's class or interacting with Dirks's class about the WPATH standards of care, you can watch this video, and Mia Hughes and I are going to be going through the most important parts of this video and linking it to the WPATH files, the document, the report that Mia Hughes created. And there's a transcript of this as well. And if you want to read Mia Hughes's work, there is a link to the WPATH files, and I'm just going to link into this now. So what Mia Hughes has done is she has created this document where she did an in-depth investigation of the WPATH organization, and you can also look at the files that it was leaked documents to Hughes and Michael Schellenberger, and then you can take a look at her incredible report. And I cannot speak highly enough of this report. And anyone who is interested in trans activism should read this report because it's incredibly comprehensive, incredibly well written, and I cannot give enough praise for the WPATH files. And needless to say, I don't want to embarrass Mia Hughes too much, but I just am amazed that she's agreed to come on my program because she is a very incredible researcher, and I'm honored that she will discuss these matters with me. And to toot my own horn a little bit, I have in-depth knowledge about trans activism at one particular university, and so I think I can perhaps add some additional information to how Mia Hughes is thinking about this issue as well. So, in terms of Murray, Mulholland, and Dirks, this started their opposition to me with regards to trans issues. There was also opposition probably to the indigenization file, which of course I was heavily involved with. I've been doing research on Indigenous politics for 30 years. So this was also a source of friction, but things started to really ramp up and become much more hostile starting at the end of 2018, when I invited Meghan Murphy to participate in the Rational Space Network. It had a critical thinking series with a number of different issues, and we did one on Does Trans Activism Negatively Impact Women's Rights with Meghan Murphy and Julie Ray Goldstein, who was a trans activist. Now, you would think that that would be acceptable because we had both the trans activist position and Murphy's position, whatever you want to clarify, basically a critic of trans activism. Some call this a gender critical position, perhaps sex affirmative, so affirming the importance of biological sex in trying to understand female-male relations. Anyway, Murphy came. It was a fantastic event. One of the only events, if not the only event of its kind, certainly in Canada. There was a lot of high energy. There was, a lot of intense emotions that were being expressed, but everyone behaved well, with the exception perhaps of one professor who wanted the cameras to be turned off, which we resisted, but that caused problems again. But still, most people behaved very well, and we were able to have a discussion about the different viewpoints on trans activism. Anyway, you can watch that event, which I provided a link to. As a result of this event, I'd never received negative comments on my course evaluations from students before, and I received them that year. And this student who feels it's a deeply personal matter for her, the trans activist kind of area. And this person says that although I'm available to provide assistance, but given my nearly inescapable reputation regarding social issues, that this is unappealing to get assistance. But I was, until recently, I never even had really formed an opinion on trans activism. I thought it was a bit odd, but my concern mainly was the attempts to shut people down and not allow us to have the discussions. That was my major issue. Anyway, this was now starting to directly enter into my workplace. And I could link this directly to professors trying to mobilize students against me on social media. Anyway, when I complained about this matter, not officially, but just letting Dean Pettit know about this matter in the arbitration process, my attempts to alert the Dean Pettit to this were used against me by Mount Royal University as one of the reasons why I should be fired, because students were complaining about me. When the complaints that students were putting forward were a direct result of them being mobilized by a number of professors to be hostile to my attempts to discuss trans activism. And then Dean Pettit, who is in the humanities. So Dean Pettit was a professor in the humanities department, has quite a close relationship with Scott Murray. I'm not sure about D.A. Dirks. Anyway, Dean Pettit, because of complaints that were being made by a number of trans people at Mount Royal, Pettit decided to invite Dirks and also Nathan Lawley, who was a trans identifying student and a member of the Students' Council, to co-present on why they believe that trans people were not being respected at Mount Royal. And in this presentation, Lawley made reference to the fact that faculty members should not post transphobic events. And of course, the only event that I knew of at Mount Royal that could be characterized as transphobic was the Does Trans Activism Negatively Impact Women's Rights events? So when I was listening to this presentation, I wanted to ask a question but I was not able to do that. We were told that we weren't allowed to ask questions. When I tried to ask a question of the dean, I was told no questions would be allowed. And I thought it was just a spontaneous kind of concern, but I learned on May 15th, 2023, during the arbitration process from Duane Bratt, who is my former chair. So he was my representative on what's called the Dean's Advisory Group, which is sort of advising the dean, that it was decided by this group of chairs that I should not be allowed to ask questions. And so they were preventing people from asking questions, specifically to stop me from asking questions, which is a violation of collegial governance when everyone's supposed to be involved in, determining what should happen in Arts Faculty Council. And the idea of collegial governance is you're supposed to allow for a diversity of opinions. But of course, anyone who is questioning trans activism, that opinion is not allowed in universities which have been captured by what would be called equity, diversity, and inclusion ideology. Sometimes this is referred to as wokeism. And of course, at Mount Royal, we had, a serious capture of the institution. And you can see those notes on the May 15th, 2023 hearing day. That's on, I've provided a link to that. And then how I wanted to ask Dean Pettit a question, but I was prevented from posing that question. So I recorded that presentation. And when I was prevented from asking questions, I thought it would be good to sound the alarm with the number of people that were either were typically at Arts Faculty Council and weren't there, or other professors, just to let them know about what appeared to be highly activist kinds of orientations which were occurring in the Arts Faculty Council. As a result of this recording being shared, and it was done by this piece in the New Telegraph was written by Alexander Dollywall. I don't know who that is. So I've never met Alexander Dollywall, but somehow Alexander Dollywall got a hold of a recording of these presentations and wrote a very critical article in this publication. And that was on January 14th, 2020, I believe. What happened then was a few weeks later, on January 24th, 2020, Mary Lee Mulholland made a motion in Arts Faculty Council, and this was seconded by Scott Murray. And the motion was to express its continued, that Art Faculty Council, the whole body, express its continued acknowledgement and support of the labor of Nathan, that's Nathan Lawley, and D.A. Dirks, and of all marginalized faculty and students in creating an inclusive and welcoming teaching and learning environment. And there we have sort of the equity, diversity, inclusion ideology, because inclusive does not mean including my questions and responding to my ideas. It means excluding those who make trans activists feel unsafe. That's what inclusivity means in this context. And it seemed to me that this motion was in direct response to that article that was published, and also to some extent implying that I was not creating an inclusive and welcoming teaching and learning environment by trying to ask questions and having recorded this meeting. The dean as well made the following comment, that arts is a place that we can have debate. Not really, because questions were not allowed. We are known for being critical and not always agreeing. Well, if you disagree on trans activism, you will suffer consequences at Mount Royal University, and especially in the Faculty of Arts. But it's important that we do this in a respectful way. Please be mindful when making choices that affect others. So that respect, that word respect, again, is coming up, and it's being implied to some extent that I'm not being respectful for, being critical of trans activism, trying to get people to understand the threats to academic freedom that are occurring. And as a result of that, about 6 months later, because COVID was happening at this time, so things were delayed, I was able to get this motion put forward on September 18th, which had a lot of opposition from various authorities at Mount Royal. They tried to stop me from doing this, but I was able to constantly press for this. And then I was able to put forward this motion, which I tried to have as a direct response to the initial motion by Mary Lee Mulholland-Scott Murray, that AFC express its acknowledgement of the labor of faculty and students in creating an intellectually inclusive environment that supports critical thinking and open inquiry about feminist philosophies pertaining to sex and gender. So I wanted it to be known. I was a bit concerned about the dean's comments, and I wanted it to be known that, the university is an intellectual space, and we should be able to criticize trans activism or these feminist philosophies that were, sort of seeing biological sex as a social construct, all these kinds of things that we're hearing now in the university environment. Anyway, I gave a justification for this, which I read out in September 2020, and this motion passed with, I believe it was 44% in favor, and I think it was 36% against, and then there was a number of abstentions. So the fact that that motion would not pass overwhelmingly, whereas the other one I heard was very high degree of support for acknowledging the labor of DA and Nathan, that gives you a sense of the emotional kind of character of what's going on in the Arts Faculty Council. Anyway, so that all happened. That created a lot of conflicts that were occurring. And then in October 2020, this is when it was announced that Dirks would be presenting a session on evaluating, discussing, and developing strategies to address white supremacy culture in the MRFA. So there was an email that was sent out. And what occurred was that Jonathan Kay, who used to be the editor of the National Post and now is the editor of Quillette, which is an Australian publication, he got a hold of this email. And once again, it was not from me. So I did not send Jonathan Kay this email. He tweeted about it and it was basically making fun of it because, of course, the Mount Royal Faculty Association is one of the most woke organizations in universities, and they do not engage in white supremacy of any kind. And so he thought that this was funny, that they were sort of admitting that they were white supremacists by this. And then Dr. Tony, who is, we don't know who that is, presumably a professor, was upset at Jonathan Kay for referring to Dirks as a they, them. And this resulted in me replying satirically about how I didn't know why Dr. Tony was upset about this, because Kay was just amplifying Dirks's wanting to be called by these pronouns. And so Kay was actually just amplifying an oppressed voice by referring to Dirks as a they, them. So that was my satirical kind of approach. So anyway, so that happened. I referred in that tweet to an MRU colleague, which, as I said in the arbitration process, if I had to do that over again, I would do a more abstract tweet and not be referring specifically to an MRU colleague, although I didn't mention Dirks by name, because Dirks had not attacked me on social media. So therefore I should be, more kind in how I was approaching my criticism of this, what I consider to be a nonsensical idea of misgendering fatigue. Because of Kay's tweets, this was covered by the Post Millennial on October 16th, 2020. And then Dirks did facilitate this session on October 23rd. The notes for it were distributed to the membership, which then resulted in me on November 20th sending a memo to Lee Easton, the president, wanting to know a bunch of things about this, since I didn't think this was a good initiative to be being promoted in the MRFA, and especially our dues were being spent to fund this. So Dirks was being paid to do this, and I wanted to know how much of our dues were being spent on this, and I was not allowed to know that. So the transparency is seriously flawed. Anyway, after I demanded this kind of accountability, 3 days later, Dirks filed a harassment complaint against me. And it's redacted because I got it through Freedom of Information. I'm still not sure of the status of the actual complete complaint that I did finally receive in arbitration several years after this had happened. So I was never able to see the complaint in its entirety when I was expected to reply to this complaint in an investigation, which is seriously procedurally flawed. This would be seen in any other context as, violations of natural justice and procedural fairness. Arbitrator David Philip Jones didn't think this was a problem at all, which is shocking. Which, of course, the arbitration process it's been highly botched, and I'm quite upset about it, but it's being appealed to the Labor Relations Board, my case. So I was then investigated, and I think I had a meeting in December 2020. A report was produced, and that one tweet on this cartoon to do with misgendering fatigue, that was found to have violated 3 policies and 2 laws: the Alberta Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Alberta Human Rights Act. David Philip Jones, again, the arbitrator, seemed to agree with that, even though other investigators would have found that not to be harassment. We needed the arbitrator to make findings of fact about this, but he just accepted the views of the investigators, even though they're all contradictory. Anyway, this is the tweet in question, right? I'm just kind of referring to Dr. Tony. I did say an MRU colleague, right? But this is the cartoon that I was satirizing, which I think you might be interested in, because as you can see, this cartoon is catastrophizing, what we call catastrophizing, about this idea being misgendered. And it's about a person who's lying on the ground and they're being told to get up by someone and saying, I can't, because being misgendered all day is mentally exhausting. And they're going to stay on the floor, and then someone's trying to pick up this person. And then when they get up, they say, everyone reacts to being misgendered differently. Every time I'm misgendered, it feels like someone is adding a brick to my backpack. As the day goes on, there are more and more bricks. By the end of the day, I feel like I'm being crushed, slowly crushed by the seemingly unending burden of the gender binary. So this is what DA Dirks was presenting in a pronouns workshop on how to use pronouns. And I thought that cartoon was pretty funny. And I still think it's really funny. And the fact that this is sort of seen as a serious kind of issue, I think should be the object of satire. That's really my view on it. And I don't apologize for that. Now, granted, maybe not, I shouldn't be referring to an MRU colleague, but, all this stuff that was going on at that time, this is not really a major kind of concern, seems to me. Anyway, so that is that cartoon. My satirizing it is what resulted in me being found to have engaged in harassment. And as a result of that, and also what happened with respect to Gabrielle Weaselhead, which is I've talked about this a lot in other posts, I was suspended without pay for 2 weeks. And this formed the basis of progressive discipline. So when I got nailed again with the Renee Watchman complaint and also filing what was alleged to be a frivolous and vexatious complaint, that was then progressive discipline, and therefore I could be terminated because of being progressive discipline. So it wasn't the reason why I was fired, but it was some of the background that made it possible for me to be fired. So that harassment complaint was investigated. A few months later, on March 14th, 2021, Scott Murray gave a presentation on, it was about actually the Israel-Palestinian conflict, about whether the MRFA should support a motion opposing the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And in this talk, Murray, in his presentation, Murray implied that Meghan Murphy's arguments in the Does Trans Activism Negatively Impact Women's Rights event were homophobic and transphobic. And that's the transcript of that section. Also, he was really saying that I was, well, he never mentioned anyone by name, but it's the only event that we had that could be, had the gender critical feminists would be Meghan Murphy. And then, of course, he's obviously talking about me here, that the anti-Indigenous views to which everyone in attendance here, with the possible exception of this other presenter, who was from, I believe, University of Toronto, has been relentlessly subjected to over and over again in every academic venue imaginable. So he's basically saying there that my views on indigenization shouldn't be protected by academic freedom because they're hateful and discriminatory. And I've responded to this in a video to these comments. Like, hate speech is a very high bar. And just because Murray might hate what I say, that doesn't mean it's hate speech. It's an absurd accusation. You can listen to the recording of that. Anyway, so Mulholland and Murray, although they were not part of the Gang of 17, were also part of this whole network of people that were trying to delegitimize my position at MRU. And that, as a result of me being ostracized and my workplace being poisoned and me reacting to that, and MRU not defending me and all sorts of problems with the union, I was eventually fired from Mount Royal University on December 20th, 2021. So after I was fired, a couple of days after that, Bruce Gilley, when he heard that I'd been fired, and I'd received some documents through Freedom of Information, so Bruce was well aware of the fact that I was being harassed by people like Gabrielle Weaselhead and Renee Watchman. He said that I was terminated under pressures from its radical Indigenous Studies faculty. And Linda Meniguns, who was the AVP of Indigenization and Decolonization, Meniguns was involved as well. We didn't know that at the time, but it was mostly the reports about Watchman and Lindstrom. also now known as Weaselhead. Anyway, so Dr. Gilley put out that tweet on December 23rd. This resulted in Scott Murray sending an email to Gilley, and it's small, the print's here. So I'm just going to read this email. This was on December 23rd. So on the 20th, I was being, when Mike Quinn was preventing me from leaving a room, which I considered to be forcible confinement, 3 days after this. Scott Murray states, I write as the chair, and Bruce Gilley sent me this email. I write as the chair of the Humanities Department at Mount Royal University, which is home to the Indigenous Studies program at MRU. I'm very curious to know what evidence you have for claiming that Frances Widdowson was terminated under pressure from its radical Indigenous Studies faculty. Surely you have evidence for making such a claim, which directly impugns the reputations of several of my very well-respected, hardworking department colleagues, as well as that of MRU as a whole. Surely the fact that you have made this claim on social media doesn't absolve you of your professional obligation to adhere to the minimum standards of evidence expected of academics in your discipline. I would be very grateful, therefore, to know what that evidence is. I'm sure he was appeared to be fishing for things that would incriminate me. Anyway, Bruce Gilley wrote about this in a December 29th piece. You can read the whole thing. I highly recommend it, and is saying that he's not going to take the bait. He's well aware of the totalitarian tactics of contemporary universities, etc. So that is a very interesting article to look at. Okay, so this is going on. Then in arbitration, Mary Lee Mulholland was one of the people called by MRU to testify against me. Murray did not testify, interestingly. Dirks was supposed to testify, but had some medical reason why Dirks could not testify. So we never got to hear about anything from Dirks. But Mary Lee Mulholland, this was amazing, this testimony. It was universally refuted. Everything that she accused me of was shown to be false because, of course, I was used to this happening and was well aware of people setting people up with false claims. So I had recorded all meetings since 2019. So everything that Mulholland argued could be refuted. The most important one is the AFC, the infamous AFC Arts Faculty Council meeting on March 5th, 2021. You can watch the entire documentary that's been produced about that Mount Royal University murders academic freedom. It's on YouTube, and it does talk about Mulholland's comments in that documentary. That does a deep dive into that absurd meeting that I was blamed for when I was the one who was being attacked by many faculty members. And then she also made false allegations about an MRFA meeting on May 8th, 2020. You can take a look at her comments there. And she claimed that Rafi Kurji and Irene Shankar, two people who were running for the board, that I said that racism, that they shouldn't be able to serve on the MRFA if they were proponents of equity, diversity, and inclusion, something like that, which I never asked anything about that at all. Rafiq Kurji, I was trying to get information on the defamation of Bob Udall. So I was wondering whether they would be subjected to a lawsuit about that. That was my question to Rafiq Kurji. And then Irene Shankar, who Mulholland claims had to go on medical leave. Widdowson's constant call to the MRFA to undermine MRFA's ability to serve on the executive took its toll, and Irene Shankar went on medical leave. because of this. Anyway, this is the question I asked Shankar. Irene Shankar was saying all this racism existed at MRU. And so I just asked, I believe you said that Mount Royal is a racist, that there's racism that's existing at Mount Royal. I'm just wondering what you're seeing with respect to that. What is the evidence of racism at Mount Royal University? That was the question. This supposedly is so traumatizing, it results in Irene Shankar going on medical leave. That's what Mary Lee Mulholland testified in the arbitration hearing. And then she also made an accusation that I disrupted this event that she'd organized called Others Within. That was on February 10th. You can see when she claims that. And then this was impossible for me to, I couldn't have gone to that event because I was organizing another event at the same time featuring David Newhouse, an Indigenous Studies professor from Trent University. And that would be appearing on the same day from 10:30 to 12 o'clock. And also I was taking David out for lunch with Massimo Pigliucci. I was very busy that day and I would have had no time to go and supposedly disrupt this event that Mulholland had organized. Anyway, so there's a whole bunch of material showing the kinds of efforts that people like Mary Lee Mulholland and Scott Murray are engaged in to make it impossible for me to return to MRU when I am not the problem. The problem is equity, diversity, and inclusion ideology, which to be inclusive, you can't ask questions about trans activism. That's what happens. And so what I wanted to do with this video is draw attention to this kind of climate that exists and the fact that on September 20th, 2024, that Murray claimed that D.A. Dirks had been deeply hurt and harmed by this one tweet where I was satirizing this misgendering fatigue cartoon. This is what he's saying in front of all the membership, and that is just not true, well, objectively. So maybe Dirks feels harmed about it, but that's a person who thinks that misgendering fatigue is a reasonable concept, when obviously that should be to some extent pushed back against. And although Widdowson asserted that in the arbitration that she would not have done things over again, have referred to an MRU colleague, mea culpa, okay, fine, I realize that's not the case. They shouldn't be doing that. But still, I want to talk about misgendering fatigue and the LGBTQ initialism and how absurd they are. Just do it more abstractly. And even if everything I'd done, if Steve Eichler, who had been investigating the Gang of 17, what's called the Gang of 17, had investigated me for that one tweet, that would not have found to be harassment. Because his standard, what you had to do to be accused of to be found to have engaged in harassment, was a very high bar, right? So we had people who were doing far worse than me who were found not to have engaged in harassment. And then I think that members of the Mount Royal Faculty Association needs to know about that, right? So this is the difficulty, is that this gets said on September 20th. People who take the words of Mary Lee Mulholland seriously, which they should not, because Mary Lee Mulholland is an incredibly unreliable witness, should not be believing, should be being a bit skeptical about what is being said. And in terms of the wider issues, which are trying to discuss trans activism at universities across Canada. I just have experience with one university, Mount Royal University, but what happened there, I believe, is not an isolated occurrence. There are great impediments to trying to do the kinds of analysis that Mia Hughes is engaged in doing. And because of all these pressures, and to some extent, what I would call intimidation, this is why we are now having this terrible, one of the reasons we're now having this terrible medical scandal of young people who cannot consent to these procedures, who are having their lives irreparably altered. sterilized, having body parts chopped off that are healthy, and when they just have psychological problems that need to be addressed psychologically and not through the medical transitioning of minors who cannot consent to these procedures. Anyway, Mia Hughes and I will be discussing this on March 27th, 2025. So that's about less than a week away. I will be posting that interview on my YouTube channel. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this video to be informative.